This is the Marin Alpine Trail XR. Or maybe I should say these are the Marin Alpine Trail XRs, because there are so many geometry adjustments built into this bike that our website, 99spokes.com, was down for weeks after trying to input all that data. Kidding, the website's fine. But in all seriousness, from the moment this bike was released, I knew I wanted to get my hands on it and see just how meaningful of an actual on-trail difference those different adjustments made. And I've been spending the last few days at the Mount Bachelor Bike Park testing just that. But of course, there's more here than just a couple flip chips. So I've also gone ahead and done my best to get an idea of what the overall ride feel of this thing is like. And of course, look into the components, see how those fared, and then what the bike's like to live with day in and day out. Let's go ahead and start with the frame. The latest generation Alpine Trail is available in 4 sizes, small through extra large, and at least for now is only offered in alloy. It also gets a 10mm bump in travel front and back from the previous version, putting it at 160 and 170mm. Obviously, the biggest talking point here is the geometry. And I'll be going into more depth on that later on, but as a brief overview, it does come with an adjustable headset cup that can alter the head tube angle plus or minus 0.75 degrees from the neutral 63-degree setting. It also features a pair of flip chips in the chainstay that adjust chainstay length and bottom bracket height by 7mm each. And finally, an additional chip in the seat stay that allows you to switch out the stock 27.5-inch rear wheel for a 29er. Obviously, the rest of the geometry is going to change just a little bit as you're altering those different chips between the 12 available settings, but in the standard setup as it comes shipped, this size large has a 490mm reach and a 643mm stack height. But like I said earlier, there is a lot more going on here than just the geometry adjustments. For starters, I think, to my knowledge, this is the first Marin to ever feature a horse link suspension design, which Marin is calling the Multi-Track 2LT. According to Marin, this change from their standard linkage-driven single pivot that they usually use was needed to get the desired suspension kinematics out of this longer travel platform, specifically decreasing anti-rise. Another highlight on the new Alpine Trail is the down tube storage compartment. This was super easy to open, even while gloved and with a water bottle cage attached, but was also a bit on the smaller side. For reference, I could fit my handy-dandy self-filming setup that I take out whenever I'm filming these reviews inside the in-frame storage on a Fuel EX, but not on this guy. And just in case you're not used to filming yourself on the ride, that probably equates to something like a multi-tool, a hand pump, and maybe an energy bar. Outside of those big things, I was also very impressed with just the overall attention to detail that went into this bike. It was nearly silent while riding, no chain slap or cable rattling, and it also looks pretty dang good too. There was also ample seat post insertion, though my size large came with a slightly underwhelming 170mm post. One thing that I would have liked to see a little bit different on this was having that down tube protection extend up the down tube a little bit further, specifically for shuttling in the back of a pickup truck. I imagine that most of this bike's climbing time is going to be on a chairlift or in a rack, and that would help protect this nice looking paint job a little bit longer. Next, let's talk components. You've probably been hearing me call this bike the Alpine Trail XR, and in this case, that stands for Extra Rad, which is essentially Marinese for having a bit higher end and sometimes more aggressive build kit, and both of which are the case here. For reference, there are 3 different Alpine Trail models currently available. There's the Alpine Trail 1, which lists for a very reasonable $3,299, the Alpine Trail XR, which is here, listing for $4,799, and the top tier XR Axis, which goes for $5,399. The XR frame set is also available to buy on its own for just $1,849, which might just be the best value of all if you ask me. Back to our test bike here though, and we'll start with the suspension, which in my opinion is probably one of the bigger highlights of the build. Up front, you have a 170mm RockShox Zeb Ultimate fork and a Super Deluxe Coil Ultimate in the back, dishing out 160mm of travel in the stock mullet configuration. I'll be honest that I don't spend a ton of time riding coil shock bikes, and I really would have liked to try this with an air spring. I think I might have gotten along with it just a little bit more, but didn't get a chance to do that. All that being said though, I think that is a personal preference thing, and if you spend a lot of time on enduro bikes with coil shocks, then I doubt you'd have that issue. Back at the front of the bike, the Zeb's legendary suppleness at the top was a good pairing for the coil, and of course, the Charger 3 damper made it really easy to get this set up for my likings, as well as make little micro adjustments based on what part of the mountain I was going to be riding. Moving on to the group set, which is taken care of by SRAM. It's got a full GX drivetrain, as well as the DB8 brakes, paired to 2 200mm rotors. all of which did an adequate job holding up to everything this bike threw at it. That said, at the risk of sounding just a little bit petty, I wouldn't have minded seeing some higher quality brakes on a bike costing close to $5,000, maybe like a pair of codes. Speaking of underwhelming, the Alpine Trail XR came with a pair of in-house Marin wheels. They did hold up fine over a few long days at the bike park, but I'd imagine after an entire season, they would be pretty dang shot. They also have a pretty low hub engagement. I did some caveman math of just rotating the cranks one full rotation, and it seems like it's probably about 16 degrees. You definitely notice that, you know, trying to fit in some pedal strokes between jumps or sprinting out of corners, stuff like that. One area that Marin did not skimp on, however, were the tires. Coming with a 2.5-inch max grip Assegai front and back with EXO Plus and double down casings respectively. These were a great fit for the bike, especially on the dusty, blown out trails that I was riding this late in the season. Rounding out the part spec are in-house bars, stem, and saddle, as well as the 170mm Trans X dropper post. Now, the dropper stayed down pretty much the entire time I had this bike, other than a quick little climbing stint I did I'll talk about more in a little bit. But if you did plan to use this as more of a trail bike where you would be doing quite a bit of pedaling, you'd probably want to upgrade that to a longer travel post pretty early on. All in all, this put the weight of my size large test bike set up tubeless and without pedals at 39.3 pounds or 17.8 kilograms, which is definitely on the heavy end of the spectrum, even for an alloy enduro bike. Let's circle back now and talk a little more in depth about those different geometry settings on the bike. There's actually 12 of them, 6 in the standard mullet setup as the bike comes, and then an essentially identical 6 in the 29-inch version. And while I didn't try every possible combination, I think I got a good sampling throughout the spectrum. I was actually pretty impressed and surprised by just how noticeable some of the differences were between those different configurations. I was skeptical going into this how noticeable that would be on the trail, but yeah, like I said earlier, you could definitely tell the difference between them. But back to our test bike, which shipped with the neutral headset cup installed, as well as the chainstays in the long and low setting, which for the number crunchers gives it a chainstay length of 442mm and a bottom bracket height of 345mm. Pretty early on, I realized I wanted to switch that out and put this in the shorter, higher setting, as this bike's nearly 130mm wheelbase felt just a bit more unruly than I really liked for the type of riding that I do and the terrain that I was riding on. This process was super easy, requiring only a 6mm hex key and no need to change chain length. I definitely got along with this shorter, higher setup a little bit better, which reduced both the chainstay length and bottom bracket drop by 7mm. This provided the change I was looking for, and the bike was noticeably easier to maneuver through tight, rooty berms, and a bit easier to pop off of side jibs. That said, even in this configuration, the Alpine Trail XR is definitely far from the most sporty, poppy enduro bike on the market right now. Definitely leans more towards just high-speed, full-blown descents, where the bike feels exceptionally planted and stable, and all you need to do is hold on for the ride. So with the back end dialed in, I went ahead and started messing with the headset cup. Now, again, like I mentioned earlier, this thing actually comes with a whole separate cup that sets in there and can alter the head tube angle by 0.75 degrees in either direction from the stock 63 degrees. This process was, again, surprisingly easy. Marin is using a proprietary headset design in which only the top cup needs to be swapped out, and that has some clever machining that eliminates the need to perfectly align the cups like you'd find on an aftermarket angle adjusting headset. My only slight worry with this whole design is the plastic, essentially washer, that sits between the lower cup and the bearing that helps mitigate any of the kind of change or angle that happens when you change out this top cup. I didn't experience any issues with it while riding, but I could see that being a fail point, especially if you're improperly torquing your headset compression cap. Back to the actual changes though, and I'm sure that in the right hands and in the right setting, the super slack 62.25 degree head tube angle would absolutely rip. But for me, it felt like a bit overkill and kind of dulled the bike more than I wanted it to, and in those tighter, more technical sections of trail, made it that much more unruly. On the flip side, the 63.75 degree head tube angle left me feeling a bit puckered at times on techier sections, but I'm sure would be appreciated on big, steep face jumps. Next, let's talk wheel size, which is the third area of geometry adjustment that's included with the Alpine Trail XR. And no, the bike does not ship with a 29-inch wheel, but if you've got one laying around, the process to go from the 27.5 to the 29 was once again very easy. Just pop out and rotate the seat stay flip chips and you're good to go. Unsurprisingly, this change in wheel size was probably the most noticeable of any of the adjustments that I made while testing the bike. And at least for the terrain at Mount Bachelor, it was for the better. Even the flow trails here are on the chunky side, and the techie trails are full of low-speed jank. And while the coil shock definitely took the edge off of these, it wasn't the plushest long travel bike I've ever ridden. The 29-inch rear wheel was noticeably smoother and helped carry a bit more speed too. I also really liked the fact that you could keep the bike in the shorter chainstay setting while using the larger rear wheel, which is not very common for bikes that have that kind of adjustment. One thing I did not notice on the trail was that by switching that around and putting it in the 29-inch setting, you actually steepen the head tube by half a degree, as well as reduce rear wheel travel by just a couple millimeters. All in all, my favorite of the 5 or 6 settings that I tested was the bike in the full 29-inch setup with the neutral headset cup and the chainstay flip chip in the short and high position. In the end, I was pleasantly surprised by the noticeable change in on-trail performance between those different geometry adjustments on the Alpine Trail XR. Now, I don't necessarily think many riders will choose to make changes frequently, but it makes it easy to dial into your specific terrain and riding style. The argument could be made that you could also just go out and test ride several different bikes and choose the one that best suits you, but a lot of people don't have that luxury. And with this guy here, between its 12 various settings, if you were to purchase this for yourself, you can almost guarantee that you're going to find one that suits your fancy. At this point, you've probably noticed the glaring absence of any climbing in this section on geometry, and that's because all of that testing was done at the bike park. I did, however, go ahead and take this bike out on one pedal-powered lap in the stock configuration. I don't think it should come as any surprise that the bike was a bit of a hog. The heavy, grippy tires were aided slightly by the firm lockout on the Super Deluxe coil shock when winching up fire roads, but when opened up for single-track climbing, the noticeable pedal bob combined with a long wheelbase and slack head tube angle required a lot of effort, both mentally and physically. On the bright side though, I did find the climbing position pretty comfortable. It's got a very steep 79-degree head tube angle, which means even with this longer 490mm reach, you're still seated pretty much in the center of the bike, and it's pretty easy to get traction. Again, of course, the plush coil shock definitely helped with that as well. It's also worth mentioning once again that this thing does just have a 170mm dropper post, and so when I was climbing it, I did have to go ahead and raise this up a couple millimeters and then put it back down again for the sense. So if you plan to use this as a pedal bike, probably going to want to upgrade that. Enduro bikes are better and in a lot of ways more diverse than they've ever been, and I think it's only fair to compare it to a bike on either side of the enduro spectrum. We'll go ahead and start off with the trail side of things. The bike I want to compare it to here is the Santa Cruz Mega Tower, or more specifically, the Mega Tower R, which at $4,999 is $200 more than the Alpine Trail XR. For that, you get a carbon frame, which helps keep the weight at a few pounds under the Marin, but also significantly lower tier components. It also has 5 more millimeters of travel in the back and is available as a 29er only with no adjustments built into it. Where the Santa Cruz really does set itself apart though is on slightly less challenging terrain and longer trail rides, where the lighter weight and more supportive VPP suspension makes these tasks much more manageable. But don't worry, it still rips on the descents, though in a slightly more sprightly manner, and is marketed as their go-to enduro race bike. The Marin, on the other hand, definitely leans more towards the bike park and free ride side of things. Like I mentioned earlier, it's not something that I'd want to pedal around very much, and then of course has that adjustable geometry. And actually, that's one of the reasons why I wanted to compare the Marin to a Santa Cruz. Now, if you wanted to buy a Santa Cruz enduro bike, you would have 2 options: the 165mm Mega Tower that we're talking about now, and the 170mm Bronson that is a mullet. The geometry on both of these bikes is more or less identical, other than the slight difference in travel and of course the wheel size. Now, if you go with the Marin, you could essentially get both of these bikes in one package. Now, do you really need both? I don't really know. Jury's out on that. So, which is the better bike? Well, if I was choosing something to be my only bike, kind of a long travel do-it-all option, then I think I would go ahead and get the sportier, more efficient Santa Cruz. But if this was going to be a dedicated bike park rig, then I'd be hard-pressed to not choose the Marin with its higher quality components, and of course, all that adjustable geometry to help me dial it into my specific needs. Now, the second comparison I want to make goes from the more trail-oriented side to the full-on free ride and bike park side of things. We're going to go ahead and compare it to the Canyon Torque CF8, a 175mm carbon fiber free ride machine listing for $4,299. In terms of value, Canyon definitely has the upper leg here, which is what you'd expect coming from a direct-to-consumer company. In terms of part spec, the two are relatively comparable, but the Canyon does so with a carbon fiber frame that of course helps keep weight just a little bit lower. The torque does have a flip chip in the rear triangle that can steepen the head tube angle by half a degree from 63.5 to 64 and marginally raise the bottom bracket, but that's it. So once again, the Marin takes the cake in terms of adjustability. On the trail, the longer travel of the Canyon definitely stands out, but not exactly in a way that you might expect. I would say it's a bit poppier and more playful than the Marin, but still feels just as bottomless on big impacts, whereas the Marin comes a bit closer to the magic carpet kind of floaty feel. So which is best for you? Well, if outright weight savings is your #1 priority, then you'd probably want to go with the Canyon. But I'd make the argument that for a dedicated shuttle or bike park bike, then you probably don't need to worry quite as much about weight. The other big difference is in ride feel. Like the Mega Tower, the torque is going to be the more playful option, but if you want something that's going to maximize your stability and confidence, especially on that fast, chunky terrain, then the Marin is going to be the bike to choose, especially in its longer and slacker settings. To wrap up, I think it's safe to say that the Marin Alpine Trail XR really does live up to the expectation of being multiple bikes in one. But what I'm a little more torn on is whether or not that's worth it. On one hand, for someone who's a tinkerer or doesn't have the ability to test ride and compare bikes, I think it's a fantastic option. I'd actually put myself in that first category, and I really enjoyed sniffing out the nuances between the various setup choices. But once I found my preferred setting, I'd probably seldom switch anything around again. And that brings me to the other side of the argument, and that has to do with all of the complexity that goes into engineering and installing these various adjustment points on the bike. This undoubtedly increased the amount of R&D and therefore price. And if I had to choose between all of the adjustments or, say, a nicer wheel set out of the box, I'd be pretty torn. I'm genuinely curious to hear your guys' thought on it. And if you had to put a price on adding adjustments like this to a given bike, how much you'd be willing to pay. You can let me know what you think down in the comments. All that aside, I had a wonderful time riding this bike for a couple weeks at the Mountain Bachelor Bike Park, and it's in terrain like that I really think this guy shines. So if you're on the market for an ultra versatile bike park or free ride machine, then I think you can look no further than the Marin Alpine Trail XR. Now, if you have any more questions about this bike, of course, leave those in the comments and I'll do my best to get you an answer. While you're there, if you haven't done so already, please go ahead, hit that like button, subscribe to the 99 Spokes YouTube channel, and lastly, remember that bikes are for everyone. Have fun out there.